So if we're thinking about the results of food production and the rise of farming, we've been talking about some of these in terms of particular health changes and health effects. We've been thinking about some of the broader, more social questions too, things like the large walls and constructions at Jericho, at Göbekli Tepe, things that are requiring people to specialize in particular aspects of their lives rather than being generalists who are all in charge of getting the food that they need and their families need any given day. I thought it would be useful to turn back to this concept map that we started the course off with and think again about some of the way the different topics here are interacting now with, and clearly some of the terms that are here in boxes are really coming into play and into interaction a lot more now than they had previously in the course. So, we touched at the beginning of the course on the rise of symbolic thought as we become biologically human, but the real heart of the interaction of these ideas is starting now with food production. The term that's over here, which is clearly connected through the Jericho and Göbekli Tepe examples to both ideology and although there's no arrow directly between food production and ideology, we could draw one. And as this notes here on the bottom, this is not an exhaustive set of connections. And also, of course, connections between food production and social complexity. There's a specialist person who carves those stones at Göbekli Tepe. There's a specialist person who directs the construction of those walls at Jericho. Is that the rise of inequality in power? That's a debate we can have, but it's definitely a relevant one now. And we're starting to see that interaction with monumental architecture, with sedentism, right? The folks at Jericho were building those walls not just for fun, but because they wanted to really protect that spring that was very important for them to survive in that particular place. And of course, that shapes and reshapes the environment that the people are living in. As well as some of the effects that all these changes have on the health of the individuals that we've been talking about. I want to continue this now by looking at a lot of these same topics and ideas in a different setting, which is the setting of Europe. And we haven't talked a great deal about European prehistory in this class, so we thought it'd be useful to have one section where we get to think about that a little bit. And in particular, I want to think about this phenomenon that gets an awful lot of press in popular culture and in those History Channel specials, and these are referred to as megaliths. The words up here on the screen, and again, I never test you on it, but if you want to go into your Greek roots there and pull that apart, mega, big, and lith, stone. So really, this is about big stones, and my joke here is that these are the results of agriculture, of farming, writ large, writ very, very large, because they're extremely large constructions. But I think that they're more important as a sort of a plot point in this story of the effects of farming and the rise of some of these major social institutions like inequality and property that so much are defining our life today. So let's think about the way that some of these ideas that we were tracing at Jericho and Göbekli Tepe and elsewhere are playing out in Europe. Farming came to Europe later than it did in the Mideast, so this chart has the Mideast, the Fertile Crescent here. I don't know why the area underneath the Fertile Crescent shows up as blue on this map. That's land, that's part of the Mideast now. But so here's the Fertile Crescent area with Iran and Iraq on this side, and then the Mediterranean coast of Lebanon, Israel, Palestine there, and southern Turkey. These are the present-day states. We talked originally about domestication of plants and animals as something that happened independently in lots of different parts of the world, and that's something that's not controversial. It certainly happened independently in the New World without input from the Old World. It's pretty easily agreed that it happened in East Asia and Sub-Saharan Africa and New Guinea and other places independently from the first place it appeared in the Mideast. Europe is a different case, actually. It's pretty clearly agreed that farming arrived in Europe through what's called diffusion. The idea being passed by person to person and group to group and adopted slowly over several thousand years as it spread from the Near East. And of course, you could think about this in the context of our discussion of why people switched to farming at all. After all of human history being gatherers and hunters, it must have taken a real jolt to the system, to use the ecological models of terms of Flannery and others. It would have taken a real jolt to the system to make people switch. And to put that another way, people wouldn't have switched unless they had a good reason to. And so it was a several thousand year process, and you see that it was only by about 6,000 years ago or so that farming really reached the better part of what today would be called Western Europe. Even as farming arrived in these areas by about 4,000 BCE, so about 6,000 years ago, most Europeans were living in very small settlements. The population was not very dense, so there were small groups. They were sedentary, using stone and wooden tools. Remember, we're a couple of thousand years still from having metal, which we'll cover later. And for the most part, people in these settlements were producing all the things they needed to survive. They were farming their own food and living, more or less hand to mouth. I mean, farm their crops and feed themselves, and that's more or less it. Many of them actually had a combination of farming techniques to survive in the environment of Europe, which is much less predictable, or at least much less conducive to some of those Middle Eastern crops than the Mideast is, wheat and barley. So many of these European peoples would have combined horticulture and pastoralism, sowing crops in the spring, using secondary and primary products of animals year-round, and sort of mixing their economic systems. Maybe one of the most interesting results, certainly the largest physical result of this rise of farming in Europe, are these big things that have become major tourist attractions and are the subjects of lots of History Channel specials that we could call megaliths. Megaliths, these big stone constructions and similar large-scale marks on the landscape, are things that were that rose in Europe shortly after farming arrived there. So farming was sort of present in Western Europe by about 4,000 BC, and most of these megaliths date to the later Neolithic and into the Bronze Age, from about 4,000 BC to about 2,000 BC. So about the 2,000 years after agriculture was introduced in Europe. So the suggestion has been made that agriculture was adopted for some reasons maybe different than in the Mideast. Maybe population pressure was not really the main cause of agricultural being adopted, at least not population pressure very intensively, but that farming actually gave rise to a population pressure by raising the carrying capacity of the land and helping more people survive, and so that population pressures may have actually been a problem at the time when these megalithic structures were being created. So that these may be in some ways kind of social efforts to socially negotiate a more conflicted landscape. What you're looking at now is an image of one of these famous sites. It's a site called Newgrange. It's in Ireland. It's just a little outside of Dublin, Ireland. If you ever find yourself in Ireland, it's an easy day trip from Dublin, so I highly recommend it. This doesn't really give you much in the way of scale. I'll give you an image in a second that has a good scale on it, but this is an immense construction. It is a huge earthen mound that covers over a megalithic construction, a stone structure where very large stones are used to form the walls and the ceiling of a long passage and chamber. The first hint of scale you get looking at this image here is over here by the entrance, and you can see two modern staircases have been built up to about a story up from the regular ground surface up to this sort of landing here on the entranceway here. So that is one story up to that main doorway, and then the building is quite a bit taller on top of that. The suggestion is that this site contains about 200,000 tons of stone, and it would have taken about 400 people 30 years to build. Now, I wouldn't ask you to remember those specific numbers, but it's a good way of noting that this is a huge construction that would have taken the work of an awful lot of people working together. Other sites that are megaliths are a lot more modest than Newgrange, which is one of the largest, but they're still something that would have been required the work of an awful lot of people. This is a site called Poulnabrone, also in Ireland, and originally it would have been covered with an earthen mound as well. That earth has been worn away over time by the weather, but also probably stripped away by people searching for buried treasure and things like that at these sites, many of which have been looted repeatedly, unfortunately. But imagine this site would have originally been covered with an earthen mound. But even though it's much smaller, it's only half a dozen large slabs of stone. Again, a person could nearly stand upright inside it. So we're talking about 20-foot long, 5, 6, 8 foot wide slabs of solid stone that have been, in many cases, moved great distances to these sites and set up in order to make these constructions, and hauled one up on top of the others to be a roof for it. So this is something that's taking an awful lot of effort. But the question is sort of for what? In these two cases and many others, the purpose of these structures is as a tomb. So we do find human burials in both of them and in many others like them. But we don't find that this is a tomb for the whole community. This is not something that the whole community makes for everyone to be buried in. Poulnabrone, for instance, had occupation and burials going on for about 600 years. And in that time, it received, as far as we can tell, just about 22 burials. So it would have taken quite a lot of work to build, and it was used for a long time, but even within that, only a couple of people per generation, 1, 2, 3 in a generation over those 600 years, would have actually received burial in it. What are we looking at here? Is this a tomb for the kings? Is this hierarchy? Is this a tomb for the religious leaders, religious ritual? Is this something like religious leaders or even sacrificial victims? Don't have good evidence that that's the case, but you could imagine a bunch of different options for why we're receiving so few burials compared to the amount of work that goes into these constructions. We could definitely continue my debate with my friend Brandon the anarchist on this one. It does certainly look like some people are receiving the benefit of this construction and others are not, even though everyone is participating in the work. So this is probably not hierarchy in the sense that we have billionaires now who get to do whatever they want, or kings and queens who had utter and complete control. But we're definitely looking at something that isn't a completely egalitarian system, a system of complete equality in the way we've certainly had before farming. So these megalithic tombs are an interesting sort of plot point in that. Here's an element for scale. This is your professor, good number of years ago now, back in 2003, I think. For scale, this is a large stone at the edge of that area, the stairway that you would have walked up that I showed in the first image. There's one to the right, and there's another one over to the left, and then this is the main entrance, and then the white stone that you sort of saw in that large-scale image starts from here and proceeds up. This is, I should say, a reconstruction of this tomb at Newgrange. It's not a complete reconstruction. It's a tomb that was restored, I think, as well as being substantially excavated and by archaeologists over quite some time. You can go in it, and in fact, here's a drawing of the inside. So here is K1 in this image is the stone that I was pictured right behind, and I was standing right there holding my umbrella. And then, you can go in the passage here, and there's these large standing stones which hold up the walls, and it's what we refer to as a corbelled ceiling, C-O-R-B-E-L, a corbelled ceiling, which is a ceiling that's created by, and you can sort of see it looks a little bit like an inverted pyramid. This is the empty space here, and then it's solid stone outside of it, but each course of stone moving higher and higher up is just a little bit sticking out further than the one below it. And if you counterbalance those stones carefully, and you build your wall carefully, and you just edge each course out a little bit, you can actually get a corbelled ceiling to cover over a pretty large area, which is makes this an extremely well-designed and carefully built construction. Sometimes there's a temptation when you look at megaliths to say, you know, obviously these are big, but, you know, it's just a big pile of rocks. It's not that hard. Well, no, I would argue, actually, that that's not true, that these are constructions that would have taken not just a lot of physical effort, but a huge amount of planning and ingenuity and knowledge to build. The person in charge of building Newgrange, this site that we're looking at here, knew very much what she or he was doing and knew how to design it. It's a person that we would call an architect today. And that's a person who has specialized skills. The person who did that work is not out there farming her or his own field. And also all the people, even if they're unskilled laborers involved in the construction, at least during the time they are building this tomb, are not farming their own fields. And so somebody else has to make enough food for those people. Instead of one person making enough food for one person or for one family, we now got farmers making enough food for them and their own families, and the people who are not farming because they are the architect of Newgrange or the workers on Newgrange or other people who are doing other work. So we're starting to get another kind of a element to this social aspect of the rise of farming. People are not just creating food for themselves anymore. We've got specialization going on, and people are spending time doing things other than creating food, and megaliths are certainly evidence for that as well as a result of it. Here's just what it looks like inside Newgrange. I believe this is from the sort of the deepest innermost part looking out, and the main pathway towards the door there in front of you. This is the main door of Newgrange, and so here's the stone I was standing behind, and here's the main passage in the middle. And if you see it, there's actually this other little, looks like a little mini entrance here on the top. And this has all sorts of different possibilities for why there's sort of another door above the door in terms of ideology, but it had one very practical purpose. And I want you to sort of remember that box there, that they call it the light box, and we'll come back to that in a little bit when we talk about henges. There's other kinds of megalithic tombs. This is a kind called a court tomb, C-O-U-R-T, court like as in courtyard. And again, we're seeing that these big stone things actually tell us an awful lot about social structure at this time. So if you imagine this whole stone shape was covered over with earth. This is a doorway here, so there's something to give you scale. A person could walk, stooped, but walk underneath this area here into these deeper inside chambers. This large area in the front, however, is probably was not covered over with dirt. It was probably sort of a courtyard, and that's what gives the name its tomb. A court is in a courtyard. The interesting thing about these tombs is there certainly were places that are not just for storage of the dead. It's probably best to think about these something like the stage of a theater. So the stage of a theater is itself an inanimate object. It's not doing anything, but it is the setting for active human interaction, and it sort of controls and is set up for the way humans interact in a particular place. The tombs would have been built this way, we think, partly because they create several different areas where different kinds of rituals could take place. In the outside area here, it's maybe 30 feet, 20 feet across. 20, 30, 50, maybe even 100 people might be able to see a ritual that's going on in the middle of that area if they wanted to see it. It's a relatively public place, and so there are probably some elements of the ceremonies, the funerals, the other rituals that are going on here that are very public. But as you move inside the tomb, into this first doorway here, probably only 10 or 12 people could actually fit inside this first room, and maybe one or two more could sort of see it from the door. But no matter how much you wanted to go in there, or even were allowed to go in there, the physical structure of the tomb makes the ceremonies that go on in that first chamber much more private. And the same effect is true of the second chamber, and finally this third, which is much smaller. So the tomb itself, the physical structure of the tomb, actually kind of creates a kind of a hierarchy. Whether it's a political hierarchy or a religious hierarchy or both is a point we could discuss, but it's true that fewer people get to take part in whatever ceremonies are going on in the deepest part of the tomb. The physical structure of the tomb limits access, and by limiting access, it says that some things are less public, are more restricted, to the ritual hierarchy or the political hierarchy or both, or whatever you'd like to imagine. But it certainly is showing us that there is probably a differentiated social set of interactions here. Some people are more important, and they're taking part in the ceremonies here, and others are less important, and they're not. Important in what way is debatable, but the tomb structure is really starting to suggest to us some level of unequal access to power, unequal access to the resources of of burial in the sort of inner sanctum of the tomb, which was created by the work of more people. So, is it, again, inequality? Not necessarily in a sense that we would recognize now, like kings and queens and billionaires versus the rest of us people, but there's definitely something more going on than just the totally egalitarian, everybody is more or less the same and doing more or less the same work of life before farming 10, 12,000, 15,000 years ago.